In November of 1930, a fur trader walked into a village of 2,000 years of unbroken tradition and found not a single living soul. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. His name was Joe LaBelle, and he had walked this frozen shoreline more times than he could count. The Inuit village on the edge of Lake Anjikuni, deep in the Padley region of the Canadian Northwest Territories, was not a mystery to him. It was a waypoint, a place of warmth, of familiar faces, of dogs barking at his approach and children racing to greet the man who always carried salt and stories from the outside world. LaBelle was 34 years old that winter, a seasoned trapper who had spent nearly 2 decades crossing the barren lands north of Hudson Bay. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in omens, and he had little patience for the wild tales that drifted through trading posts like smoke. He believed in tracks in the snow, in the weight of a good rifle, in the discipline that kept a man alive in a country that killed the careless without ceremony. That discipline was the only reason he survived what he found that night. The village should have been alive with sound long before he reached it. Sound carried strangely across the frozen lake, the crack of ice, the bark of huskies, the low murmur of voices around a fire. Instead, there was nothing. Not silence exactly, but an absence, as though the world itself had forgotten how to make noise in this one particular place. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, the way it often did in the barrens. He quickened his pace anyway. When he reached the first tent, his lantern light fell across an iron pot still hanging over the ashes of a cooking fire, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The stew inside had frozen solid, but beneath the frozen crust, it looked as though it had still been simmering only hours before. Whoever had been tending that fire had walked away without so much as a backward glance. The camp held roughly 30 people, men, women, and children of a small Inuit community that had lived along the shores of Anjikuni for generations beyond memory. LaBelle had visited them dozens of times over the years. He knew their names. He knew Chief Utek's laugh, the particular way the old man tilted his head when he was skeptical of a trader's price. He knew which children had been born that spring, and which elders had grown too frail to hunt. Now the tents stood open to the wind, their skin flaps torn loose and snapping uselessly in the dark. LaBelle moved from shelter to shelter with mounting horror, his lantern casting long, trembling shadows across scenes that made no sense. Sewing needles lay half-threaded on skins, as though the seamstress had simply set down her work mid-stitch. A rifle no Inuit hunter would ever willingly abandon in a land where survival depended on it, leaned against a support pole, loaded, untouched. There was food, there was clothing, thick with the insulation needed to survive -40 temperatures. There was every possession a family in the barrens could not afford to leave behind, and there was not a single person to claim any of it. LaBelle's mind reeled through explanations, each one collapsing under its own weight. A raid would have left the signs of struggle, blood, disturbed snow. A mass evacuation from starvation or disease would have left tracks, dozens of them, radiating outward from the camp toward the nearest hunting grounds or trading post. He found none. The snow around the village, fresh and undisturbed beneath the previous night's fall, told a story that defied everything he understood about how human beings moved through the world. There were no footprints leading away, not one. And then he found the dogs. 7 sled dogs, still tethered to their stakes, had starved to death in their harnesses. Whatever had happened, it had happened fast enough, and completely enough that no one had returned even to free the animals that would have died anyway without their masters. The cruelty of that detail sat heavier on LaBelle than almost anything else he witnessed that night. These were not people who abandoned their dogs. Dogs meant survival. Dogs meant life. He built a fire that night at the edge of the ruined camp, too shaken to sleep, listening to a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, as though something vast and patient was watching him from just beyond the reach of his firelight. By morning, LaBelle had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not simply report this to the nearest trading post and let the matter die in a filing cabinet. He needed help, and he needed it from people with the authority and the resources to search a land this unforgiving. The nearest telegraph operator was a man far to the south, and it took LaBelle days of hard travel to reach him, fighting through drifts and a cold so severe it could freeze exposed skin in minutes. When he finally arrived, frostbitten and gaunt, and described what he had found, the operator did not believe him. Not until LaBelle mentioned one final detail, the detail that had haunted him the entire journey south. On the ridge above the village, half buried in snow, he had found a grave. Not the shallow, hastily dug graves of a people fleeing in panic, but an old burial site, one that had clearly existed before the disappearance. Someone, or something, had dug it open. The stones that should have sealed it were scattered, and the body that should have been inside was gone. The telegraph operator's hands shook as he relayed the message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Within days, according to the accounts that would circulate for decades afterward, officers began arriving at trading posts and remote outposts across the region, their questions carrying an urgency that unsettled everyone who spoke with them. But it was what happened next, reported by multiple independent witnesses across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, none of whom had any way of coordinating a story, that transformed a local tragedy into something the world could not stop talking about. On the same night the village had gone silent, trappers and travelers scattered across the Northwest Territories reported the same extraordinary phenomenon. A strange, glowing light, oval in shape and impossibly bright, moving across the sky in a direction that seemed to trace a path directly over Lake Anjikuni. Some described it as blue-white. Others swore it pulsed, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. It moved against the wind. It made no sound. One of the men who reported it was a trapper named Armand Laurent, working a line nearly 60 miles from the village. He had no knowledge of Anjikuni's fate when he saw the light, and no reason to invent a story that would connect the two events. When investigators later compared his account to LaBelle's timeline, the pieces fit together with an unnerving precision that no one could explain, and no one could dismiss. What, exactly, had passed over that lake in the hours the village fell silent? And why, of everyone who might have answered that question, was there no one left alive to ask? The Royal Canadian Mounted Police mounted what accounts describe as one of the most extensive search operations the region had ever seen, dispatching officers by dog sled and, in a rare move for the era, by aircraft, a technology still in its infancy for Arctic search operations in 1930. The barrens around Lake Anjikuni were vast, brutal, and almost entirely uncharted by the standards of southern Canada. Searching them was less like conducting an investigation, and more like attempting to find a single grain of sand scattered across a frozen ocean. What they found deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. There were no bodies, there was no evidence of a massacre, no evidence of disease, no evidence of the kind of catastrophic accident, a fire, a flood, an avalanche, that might explain 30 people vanishing simultaneously. The tents remained standing, weathered by wind but otherwise exactly as LaBelle had described them. The dogs, what remained of them, told the same grim story of abandonment. The food stores sat untouched by human hands, though scavenging animals had begun to pick through what the cold had preserved. Investigators interviewed everyone within reach, trading post operators, missionaries, other Inuit communities scattered across the region. No one had seen the villagers leave. No one had heard reports of them arriving anywhere else. It was as though the entire community had simply ceased to exist between one sunset and the next, leaving behind only their possessions as proof they had ever been there at all. The pressure on the investigation mounted from an unexpected direction. As word of the disappearance spread, first through regional newspapers, then through wire services that carried the story across Canada and eventually into the United States and Europe, the RCMP found itself managing not just a search for missing persons, but a public relations crisis. Sensational reporting had already begun attaching wild theories to the case: alien abduction, supernatural vengeance, the wrath of spirits disturbed by the encroachment of outside trade. Officials, wary of feeding a growing sense of panic and mockery, became increasingly guarded in what they would confirm to the press. This guardedness would later fuel decades of suspicion that the government was hiding something it did not want the public to know, suspicion that hardened into near certainty when, some years later, official records relating to the case proved difficult, and in some tellings nearly impossible, for researchers to locate at all. LaBelle himself became something of a reluctant celebrity in the wake of the story's spread, a role he despised. He gave interviews reluctantly, always careful to stick to exactly what he had seen and touched with his own hands, refusing to speculate about lights in the sky or forces beyond human understanding. But even his measured, methodical testimony did nothing to slow the story's transformation into legend. If anything, his credibility as a hardened, unsentimental woodsman made the account more unsettling, not less. This was not a man prone to fantasy, and yet what he described defied every rational explanation available to him. As the search stretched into its second and third week without resolution, investigators turned to the surrounding Inuit and Dene communities, hoping that oral tradition or recent encounters might offer some thread to follow. What they found instead was a silence of a different kind. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of people who understood, in ways the outside investigators did not, that some things in this land were not meant to be spoken of carelessly. Several elders eventually agreed to speak, though accounts of what they said vary depending on which telling of the story one encounters. Some described a persistent, low-frequency sound that had been reported in the region in the weeks before the disappearance, not unlike distant thunder, but continuous, and felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. Hunters had grown reluctant to travel near the northern shore of the lake in the days leading up to LaBelle's discovery, citing a wrongness in the air that they struggled to put into words for the mounted police officers questioning them. One elder, whose name would be recorded only as an old woman of the Padley region in the surviving accounts, reportedly told investigators of an older story, one that predated the trading posts, predated the missionaries, predated even the oldest living memory of her people. It spoke of the lake itself as a place of passage, a thin point in the world where the boundary between what could be seen and what could not grew fragile in certain seasons, under certain skies. She would not elaborate further, and the investigators, out of their depth and increasingly desperate for something concrete, pressed her for details she either could not or would not provide. Whether this story reflected genuine, ancient tradition, or whether it was shaped and reshaped by the sensational retelling that followed the disappearance in the decades since, remains one of the case's most contested points. What is certain is that the region's indigenous communities treated the disappearance with a gravity and a caution that the outside investigators, for all their resources, could never quite match, as though they understood something about Lake Anjikuni that a badge and a rifle could not protect a person from. It was around this time that a second detail emerged, one that had been overlooked in the initial chaos of the discovery. The village's sled dogs were not the only animals found dead. Search parties combing the wider area reported finding caribou, dozens of them in isolated clusters, dead in the snow with no visible wounds, no signs of predation, no evidence of the harsh winter conditions that might otherwise explain a die-off. They had simply dropped, mid-stride in some cases, as though something had reached out across the frozen landscape and silenced them exactly as it had silenced the village. If a natural disaster, a raid, or even a plague could explain the disappearance of 30 people, none of those explanations accounted for animals dying in the open wilderness for miles around, untouched by human hands and unmarked by any visible cause. The pattern radiating outward from Lake Anjikuni was not the pattern of a localized tragedy. It was the pattern of something that had moved through the land itself. For decades after 1930, the story of Lake Anjikuni circulated primarily through newspaper retrospectives, radio programs, and the kind of word-of-mouth embellishment that transforms a strange local event into enduring legend. Each retelling added details. Each retelling subtracted others. By the time researchers in the latter half of the 20th century attempted to return to primary sources, official RCMP case files, original newspaper wire reports, first-hand testimony from LaBelle himself, the trail had grown maddeningly difficult to follow. Some researchers who requested official mounted police records related to the case reported being told that no such records existed, or that the files that once existed could no longer be located. Given the extensive, multi-week search operation that multiple period newspapers described in detail, complete with named officers and specific dates, the apparent absence of any surviving official documentation struck skeptics and believers alike as strange in its own right. Though skeptics would argue this was simply the ordinary erosion of record-keeping across 9 decades, in a remote jurisdiction, for a case that authorities of the time may never have formally classified as they would today. This gap between the vividness of the story's public retelling and the apparent thinness of its paper trail became, for many who investigated the case in later years, almost as significant as the disappearance itself. If the event had truly unfolded, as LaBelle and the period newspapers described, if a search this large involving aircraft and officers dispatched across hundreds of miles had truly taken place, where were the records? And if the event had been embellished, exaggerated, or in the most skeptical readings invented almost wholesale by a press hungry for a sensational winter story, why did the details align so precisely across supposedly independent regional newspapers, each reporting from a different vantage point along the search's timeline? Neither explanation offered full comfort. The believers were left defending a case built on testimony that grew harder to verify with each passing decade. The skeptics were left explaining away a pattern of corroborating detail that should not exist if the story were pure invention. It was this unresolved tension between a story too detailed to have been fabricated from nothing and a paper trail too thin to satisfy rigorous historical scrutiny that would keep Lake Anjikuni alive in the public imagination long after Joe LaBelle himself had faded from view. He gave his final interview on the subject in the early 1940s, and by most accounts retreated from public life afterward, unwilling to keep reliving a single night that had already taken more from him than he was willing to admit. He reportedly told one interviewer that he no longer trusted silence the way he once had. In the Barrens, he said, silence used to mean safety. After Anjikuni, it meant something was listening. In the decades that followed, as the story of Lake Anjikuni spread through books, documentaries, and eventually the internet, a parallel effort emerged among historians and researchers determined to separate verified fact from decades of accumulated embellishment. Their findings complicated the legend considerably, without ever fully dismantling it. Several researchers traced the earliest widely circulated version of the story to a single newspaper account from November 1930, later expanded and dramatized in subsequent retellings, including a well-known radio broadcast years later that added vivid details never present in the original reporting, details that would go on to become inseparable from the official version of the legend told and retold in the years since. This has led a significant number of historians to conclude that the Lake Anjikuni disappearance, as popularly known, complete with the frozen stew, the abandoned rifle, the glowing lights in the sky, may be substantially a product of embellishment layered onto a much smaller, more mundane kernel of truth, or possibly no verified historical event at all. And yet the case refuses the clean dismissal that skeptics would prefer. Genealogical and community researchers examining Inuit oral history and regional missionary records from the period have found no clear record of a specific, named community of that size vanishing from the Padley region in 1930, but they have also acknowledged the profound limitations of the historical record for indigenous communities in this era, when births, deaths, and migrations were often undocumented by the colonial institutions responsible for keeping official records at all. The absence of a paper trail proving the disappearance happened is not, these researchers caution, equivalent to proof that it did not. This is the uncomfortable space Lake Anjikuni occupies nearly a century later. A story too widely reported in its own era to have been invented from nothing, yet too thinly documented in verifiable primary sources to be accepted without serious reservation. It sits in the same uneasy territory as so many of history's most enduring mysteries. Cases where the truth may be smaller and sadder than the legend, or where the legend may be the only surviving trace of a truth that the historical record was never built to preserve. What cannot be disputed is the effect the story has had in the decades since. It became a touchstone for an entire genre of lost village disappearance stories that followed. It shaped public fascination with the barren lands of the Canadian North as a place where the ordinary rules of explanation seemed to bend, and it left behind a question that neither believers nor skeptics have ever fully answered. If nothing happened at Lake Anjikuni, why does the story still feel, to everyone who hears it, like something that could have? Modern expeditions to the region around Lake Anjikuni have found little to confirm the specific physical details of the 1930 accounts. No clearly identifiable remains of the described village, no definitively dated artifacts that could anchor the story to a precise location and moment. This is, in itself, unsurprising. The barrens are a landscape that erases evidence with brutal efficiency. Wood rots, skin tents decay, and 9 decades of shifting permafrost and seasonal flooding can erase a settlement's footprint almost entirely. But those who travel to the region still describe an atmosphere that lingers independent of whatever historical verdict is eventually reached. Inuit guides, who lead researchers and curious travelers through the area, speak of the lake with a particular carefulness, a respect that goes beyond ordinary caution around a remote and unforgiving wilderness. Whether that respect stems from a genuine historical trauma passed down through generations, from decades of the legend itself shaping how the region is perceived, or from something else entirely, is a question that resists any tidy resolution. What seems clear, even to the most dedicated skeptics, is that Lake Anjikuni endures not because it has been proven, but because it has never been fully disproven either. It exists in the narrow, haunting space between confirmed history and outright fabrication, a space that human beings, across every culture and every era, have always found more unsettling than either certainty could ever be. A proven massacre can be mourned. A proven hoax can be dismissed. A story that might be either, and that no amount of searching has ever definitively resolved, simply waits. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the vanishing at Lake Anjikuni. Not the specific fate of 30 people who may or may not have existed exactly as described, but the enduring reminder that the vast, frozen expanses of the North still hold places where the official record runs thin, where oral history and second-hand testimony are often the only surviving witnesses, and where the line between what happened and what was believed to have happened blurs until it becomes almost impossible to separate the two. Joe LaBelle died in 1958, according to the most commonly cited accounts, having spent nearly 3 decades as the singular, reluctant face of a mystery he never asked to carry. He gave no deathbed confession, no final revelation that might settle the matter one way or another. He simply carried what he had seen, or believed he had seen, to the end of his life, the same way the land itself seems to carry its silence, without explanation, without apology, and without any obligation to satisfy the living. Nearly a century later, Lake Anjikuni still appears on maps of the Canadian Northwest Territories, an unremarkable body of water among thousands scattered across a landscape most of the world will never see. Nothing about its physical appearance hints at the story attached to its name. There is no memorial, no official marker, no institutional acknowledgement that anything extraordinary, whether tragedy, hoax, or something in between, ever occurred along its shores. And yet the story persists, told and retold across generations of readers and researchers who were not yet born when Joe LaBelle first walked into a silent, abandoned camp with nothing but a lantern and a rifle for company. It persists in documentaries, in books devoted to unexplained disappearances, in late-night conversations between people drawn to the particular chill of a mystery that refuses to resolve. Perhaps that persistence is itself the most honest answer the case will ever offer. Not a confirmation of aliens or ancient spirits or covert government tests. Not a triumphant debunking that reduces the entire affair to embellished journalism and nothing more. Simply a story, sitting exactly where history and legend blur together, refusing every attempt to pull it fully into one category or the other. Somewhere in the Barrens north of Hudson Bay, the wind still moves across a frozen lake the way it always has, indifferent to the question of what did or did not happen there one night in 1930. The tents are long gone. The dogs are long gone. Joe LaBelle is long gone. But the silence he described, the particular, occupied silence of a place that seemed to be listening back, is, in the telling of this story at least, still exactly where he left it. And somewhere, in an archive that may or may not still exist, in a file that researchers may or may not ever locate, the only people who could ever answer with certainty what happened at Lake Anjikuni remain, as they have for nearly 100 years now, simply gone.